The morning of June 15th, 1944. A Sherman tank named Cobra King sat motionless in a sunken lane somewhere south of Carentan, France. Staff Sergeant Robert Baumgartner could hear the engine idling, feel the vibration through his boots, smell the mix of diesel and summer grass that filtered through the driver's hatch. But he couldn't move forward. Ahead of him rose a wall of earth and vegetation that had stood in this exact spot for perhaps 800 years, a hedgerow. The French called it a bocage, and it had just killed 2 men from his platoon. The Germans didn't need to see them. They knew exactly where American armour would be. Stuck at the base of these ancient field boundaries, tanks tilted upward at impossible angles, their thin belly armour exposed to any Panzerfaust team with patience and a steady hand. Baumgartner had watched it happen to Lieutenant Morrison's tank 20 minutes earlier. The Sherman had attempted to bull through the hedgerow, diesel, roaring, treads churning mud and roots. The tank had climbed, nose rising like a breaching whale, and for perhaps 3 seconds its entire vulnerable underside was visible to anyone watching from the opposite field. The Panzerfaust round had entered below the turret. The tank burned for 11 minutes before the ammunition cooked off. This was not what anyone had planned for. Not the generals who had orchestrated the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Not the engineers who had designed the duplex drive swimming tanks or the specialized armor for breaching Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Certainly not the tank crews who had trained in the open terrain of England and expected, once past the beaches, to fight a war of movement across the fields of France. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Bocage of Normandy was not mentioned in a single briefing Baumgartner had attended before D-Day. The intelligence maps showed fields, roads, and villages. What they didn't show, what apparently no one had thought to emphasize, was that those fields were not open. They were medieval parcels, each one surrounded by earthen embankments 4 to 6 feet high, crowned with centuries of compacted root systems, hawthorn, oak, brambles, and elm trees that could grow 40 feet tall. The Norman farmers had built these boundaries over generations, piling stones and earth to mark property lines and keep livestock contained. The roots had knitted together into barriers as dense as concrete. For a German defender, this landscape was a gift. Every field was a fortress. Every hedgerow was a trench line that didn't need digging. An MG-42 machine gun team could set up in a gap between 2 hedges and command an entire lane. Mortar teams could drop rounds with precision, knowing exactly where American tanks would bottleneck. Snipers could move through the maze unseen, firing from one position and disappearing into the next field before anyone could return effective fire. For the American and British forces pouring inland from the beaches, the Bocage was becoming a death trap that stretched across every mile they needed to advance. The problem had revealed itself within hours of the breakout from the beachhead. 1st Infantry Division, 4th Infantry Division. The 29th, every unit that pushed south from Omaha and Utah beaches, ran headlong into this terrain. Tank commanders quickly learned that attempting to drive through a hedgerow meant exposing their tank's belly to enemy fire. Attempting to go around meant funneling into the narrow sunken lanes, ancient pathways worn below ground level over centuries, where a single, well-placed mine or anti-tank gun could disable the lead vehicle and trap an entire column. The tactical calculus was brutal. A German infantry company with machine guns, Panzerfausts, and mortars could hold a single hedgerow against an American battalion for hours, sometimes days. The defenders had clear fields of fire across 40-yard field widths. Attackers had to cross open ground under fire, reach the base of the hedgerow, and then either find a gap or try to climb over all while taking casualties from 3 sides. By late June, the advance that was supposed to knife deep into France had slowed to a crawl. Units were measuring progress in fields taken, not miles covered. The 82nd and 101st Airborne, elite units that had jumped into this same terrain on D-Day, were fighting field to field, in what veterans would later describe as worse than anything they'd seen in the mountains of Italy. General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army, watched his timetable disintegrate. The plan had called for breaking out of the beachhead, capturing the road network around Saint-Lô and driving toward the open terrain where American armor superiority could dominate. Instead, his divisions were bleeding themselves white against obstacles that hadn't appeared in any pre-invasion briefing. The Hedgerow problem wasn't just tactical, it was industrial. The United States had shipped thousands of tanks to Europe. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh were producing Shermans faster than Germany could build Panthers or Tigers. American superiority in armor, in air support, in artillery was overwhelming on paper, but in the Bocage, none of that mattered. A 75-ton Tiger tank and a 30-ton Sherman were equally helpless when confronted with an 800-year-old pile of earth and roots. This was the irony that would have delighted German propaganda if they'd understood it fully. The greatest industrial power in human history, the nation that had built the arsenal of democracy, was being stopped by French farmland. Tank crews began attempting improvisation almost immediately. Some units tried using explosives to blast through hedgerows, dangerous work that often succeeded only in alerting every German within half a mile to their exact position. Others attempted to find gaps or gates, but these were invariably covered by pre-sighted German weapons. A few creative officers tried using tanks in pairs, with one providing covering fire while another rushed a hedge, but the vulnerability window remained and losses mounted. The engineers were called in. Could they bulldoze the hedgerows? Yes, but slowly, and bulldozers were even more vulnerable than tanks. Could they use Bangalore torpedoes, the explosives that had cleared wire on D-Day? Sometimes, but it was loud, dangerous, and consumed supplies faster than the logistics chain could deliver them. What the situation needed was a way to let a Sherman tank break through a hedgerow without climbing it. The tank needed to stay low, keep its belly armor protected, and punch through at ground level with enough force to create a gap. It needed to happen quickly enough to maintain tactical surprise, and be simple enough that every tank in the European theatre could be modified with available materials. By mid-June, this problem had moved from tactical curiosity to strategic crisis. Eisenhower himself was aware of the Hedgerow dilemma. The Supreme Commander had staked the entire campaign on a rapid breakout from Normandy. The Germans were rushing reinforcements toward the front. Every day spent fighting field to field gave the Wehrmacht more time to establish defense lines, more time to bring up reserves, more time to turn Normandy into a grinding attrition battle that would waste the Allied advantage in men and material. In the 2nd Armoured Division, various soldiers and officers were working on the problem independently. Tankers were welding scrap metal to the front of their Shermans, trying different configurations of steel beams and angle iron. Most didn't work well. Some actually made the problem worse, adding weight without adding penetrating power. Sergeant Curtis G. Coolin Jr. was a tank commander in the division's maintenance section. He was 26 years old, from Cranford, New Jersey, and before the war he'd worked as a cab driver, a job that had given him familiarity with mechanical improvisation and the kind of problem-solving that came from keeping old equipment running with whatever was at hand. Coolin had been watching the failed experiments. He'd seen tankers try to ram through hedgerows with reinforced bow plates. He'd watched engineers attempt to use specialized equipment that took too long to deploy. And he'd been thinking about the specific mechanics of the problem. A hedgerow's strength came from its root system, centuries of intertwined growth that held the earthen embankment together. To break through, you needed something that could cut those roots while pushing through the earth, something strong enough to handle the resistance but designed to keep the tank level. The key insight came from considering what was abundant in Normandy in June of 1944, German beach obstacles. The Atlantic Wall had been studded with anti-invasion devices made from heavy steel. Belgian gates, massive frames designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft, were lying abandoned all along Utah and Omaha beaches. These were constructed from railroad steel and angle iron, materials far stronger than anything a tank crew could scavenge from a wrecked vehicle or find in a French barn. Coulin's design was elegantly simple. He proposed welding steel prongs, tusks, essentially to the front of a Sherman tank. These prongs would be made from sections of German beach obstacles, cut to length and angled forward and down. When the tank approached a hedgerow, These steel tusks would bite into the base of the embankment at ground level. As the tank drove forward, the prongs would cut through roots and earth like a plow, creating a gap wide enough for the tank to pass through without climbing. The critical advantage: the crevity tank stayed level. Its belly armor remained protected. It could smash through a hedgerow in seconds rather than minutes, maintaining momentum and tactical surprise. Cullen built a prototype and tested it in late June. The results were immediate and dramatic. Where unmodified Shermans had to probe for gates or risk the suicidal climb and expose maneuver, Cullen's modified tank simply drove through the hedgerow as if it were tall grass. The steel prongs ripped through root systems that had been growing since the Middle Ages. Earth and vegetation sprayed to either side, and the tank emerged into the next field ready to fight, not vulnerable and stuck halfway over an embankment. Word spread quickly through the division. Other tankers saw the test and immediately understood the implications. Officers who had been struggling with the bocage problem for weeks recognized they were looking at a solution that was both effective and scalable. The design reached General Bradley through official and unofficial channels simultaneously. Tank crews were already asking their unit welders to copy Cullen's design. Meanwhile, officers were writing up formal reports. Bradley, desperate for any answer to the hedgerow crisis, ordered an immediate evaluation. The evaluation confirmed what the tank crews already knew. This worked. A Sherman, equipped with Cullen's device, soon nicknamed the Rhino after its horn-like appearance, could breach a hedgerow in 5 to 10 seconds. The tank remained combat effective throughout. Casualties from the breach dropped dramatically because there was no vulnerability window. Bradley made the decision that would define the next phase of the Normandy campaign. Every tank in First Army would be modified. Immediately. This is where American industrial capacity demonstrated its true character. The problem wasn't designing a solution, Cullen had done that. The problem was manufacturing thousands of these devices and installing them on tanks that were already in combat, scattered across dozens of units in an active war zone. The response was extraordinary. Ordnance units across the beachhead began cutting up German beach obstacles. Welders worked around the clock. The design was simple enough that it didn't require specialized tools or exotic materials. Any competent welder with access to a cutting torch could fabricate a Rhino device in a few hours. By early July, hundreds of Shermans were being modified. By mid-July, the number reached into the thousands. The transformation happened in roughly 3 weeks from Cullen's successful test to widespread deployment across multiple divisions. This was not the product of some elaborate supply chain stretching back to factories in America. This was field improvisation happening at the front lines, using enemy materials, executed by maintenance crews and welders who understood that speed mattered more than perfection. The Germans noticed the change almost immediately. Their defensive doctrine in the Bocage had relied on predictability. They knew where American tanks would be vulnerable. They knew how long it took for infantry to cross a field under fire. They knew the rhythm of American attacks because the terrain had forced those attacks into patterns. The Rhino tanks broke those patterns. Suddenly, Sherman tanks were appearing where they shouldn't be, bursting through hedgerows that were supposed to be impassable, hitting German positions from unexpected angles. The careful defensive geometry of the Bocage overlapping fields of fire, pre-sighted kill zones, started to fall apart when attackers could simply drive through walls instead of funneling through gaps. The psychological impact on German defenders was significant. They had been told they were facing an enemy that relied on material superiority but lacked tactical creativity. The Bocage had seemed to prove this. American attacks had been straightforward, predictable, vulnerable. Now those same Americans were adapting, faster than the German command structure could respond. This was a pattern that would repeat throughout the war. American forces encountering a problem, improvising a solution, and then mass-producing that solution with a speed that seemed to violate the normal timelines of military bureaucracy. The Rhino device wasn't revolutionary technology. It was cut-up beach obstacles welded to tank hulls. But it was exactly what was needed, deployed exactly when it was needed, in quantities that overwhelmed any German attempt at countermeasures. The modification of thousands of tanks didn't happen because some general in Washington ordered it. It happened because a sergeant from New Jersey figured out a solution. Other tankers recognized it worked, and the command structure was flexible enough to approve mass production in days rather than months. By the time Operation Cobra Bradley's major breakout offensive launched on July 25, 1944, a substantial portion of 1st Army's armor was equipped with Rhino devices. The operation's success depended on rapid movement once the initial German defensive line was breached. The Bocage had been the ultimate obstacle to rapid movement. Now it was merely terrain. The breakthrough, when it came, was devastating. American armored divisions that had been stuck fighting field by field suddenly broke into open country south of St. Lo. German defensive lines that had held for weeks collapsed in days. By early August, Patton's Third Army was racing across France, and the war of attrition in the hedgerows was over. Coulin's innovation didn't change the fundamental material balance of the war. America still had more tanks, more fuel, more artillery shells than Germany could hope to match. But it removed an obstacle that had been neutralizing that material advantage. It turned the Bocage from a German asset into merely another type of terrain. The story is often told as a triumph of American ingenuity, and it was, but it's also a story about institutional failure and recovered competence. The hedgerow problem should never have been a surprise. Normandy's bocage terrain was well documented. French maps showed the field patterns. Agricultural histories described the ancient embankments. British and American intelligence had access to all of this information. Somehow, in the massive planning operation that produced D-Day, no one flagged the bocage as a critical obstacle. Tank crews trained in England's open countryside. Intelligence briefings focused on German defensive positions, not French agricultural practices. The result was thousands of soldiers encountering terrain they hadn't been prepared for, using equipment that wasn't designed for the mission at hand. What saved the situation wasn't better planning from above. It was improvisation from below sergeants and junior officers who saw a problem and fixed it with whatever materials were available. The command structure's credit lies in recognizing the solution and scaling it rapidly, not in preventing the problem in the first place. This pattern of ground-level innovation would characterize much of the American war effort. The M4 Sherman tank itself was not superior to German heavy armor in direct combat, but it was reliable, easy to repair, and could be modified in the field. Tankers added sandbags for extra armor, experimented with different gun configurations, and adapted their tactics constantly. The Sherman that entered combat in North Africa in 1942 was not the same machine, functionally, as the Rhino-equipped version smashing through Norman hedgerows in 1944. German military culture, for all its tactical sophistication, struggled with this kind of adaptation. Solutions came from the top down, often brilliant but slow to implement. When problems emerged in the field, reports had to travel up the chain of command, wait for engineering studies, and then deployment of new equipment, manufactured back in Germany. By the time a German response to a tactical problem reached the front lines, American forces had often moved on to a new improvisation. The Hedgerow cutter exemplified everything the Wehrmacht had failed to understand about fighting the United States. American industry could outproduce Germany, this was obvious and well known. What was less obvious was the tactical flexibility built into that industrial system. American equipment was designed to be modified. American doctrine emphasized initiative at junior levels. American logistics could support field modifications on a massive scale. A German sergeant who identified a tactical problem could report it. An American sergeant could solve it, and by next week his solution could be deployed across an entire army. This wasn't because American soldiers were inherently more creative than German soldiers. It was because the American military system in World War II was optimized for exactly this kind of distributed problem-solving. The industrial base could produce standardized equipment in enormous quantities. The tactical culture encouraged modification and experimentation. The logistics network could distribute innovations rapidly. The command structure could authorize mass adoption of field modifications without waiting for a formal procurement process. Kulin's Rhino device moved from prototype to army-wide deployment in roughly the time it would have taken a German innovation to receive approval for engineering study. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The actual combat deployment of Rhino-equipped tanks revealed nuances that the initial tests hadn't fully captured. In practice, breaking through a hedgerow with the device was loud, violent, and created enormous clouds of dust and debris. This made the tactic less stealthy than some officers had hoped. German defenders in the next field would hear a Sherman coming before they saw it, the grinding of steel through roots, the diesel engine at full throttle, the crash of vegetation and earth. But this noise proved to be a feature rather than a bug. The psychological effect on German infantry was substantial. Defensive positions in the Bocage had felt secure precisely because they were hidden and protected by natural barriers. Hearing those barriers being demolished, knowing that 30 tons of American armor was about to burst through a wall you'd thought was solid, that changed the tactical calculus for defenders who were already outnumbered and outgunned. German after-action reports from late July and early August 1944 contain repeated references to American tanks appearing unexpectedly or from impossible angles. These weren't Supermen or wonder weapons. These were standard Shermans with welded scrap metal, driven by crews who now had an answer to terrain that had previously defined the limits of armor employment. The Rhino's effectiveness was amplified by its combination with other tactical innovations. American infantry had developed their own techniques for Bocage fighting small unit tactics, emphasizing firepower and movement, generous use of artillery and air support, and a willingness to bypass strong points rather than reduce them frontally. When infantry tactics and armor capabilities both evolved simultaneously, the cumulative effect was overwhelming. Operation Cobra's planning had always depended on achieving breakthrough. Bradley's staff knew that German defenses in Normandy were deep, but not infinitely deep. If First Army could punch through the main defensive belt and reach open terrain, the advantages of American mobility and firepower would become decisive. The challenge was making that initial breach without taking casualties that would prevent exploitation. The Rhino tanks provided the breach capability that made Cobra feasible. When the operation kicked off on July 25th, following a massive aerial bombardment, American armor didn't just attack, it moved. Units that would have spent days fighting through 3 or 4 hedgerow-bounded fields could now cover the same distance in hours. This speed prevented German forces from establishing coherent defensive lines after the initial bombardment disrupted their positions. The breakthrough came south of Saint-Lô, where the Bocage began to give way to more open countryside. Once American armor reached this transition zone, the character of the fighting changed completely. Suddenly, the war looked like the war planners had envisioned: mobile columns, exploitation of gaps, encirclement of German units that couldn't retreat fast enough. The German response to Operation Cobra was hampered by decisions made weeks earlier. High Command had committed significant forces to containing the British and Canadian attacks around Caen, believing that sector represented the main Allied effort. When Bradley's offensive revealed itself as the decisive blow, German reserves were out of position and the road network was under constant Allied air attack. Moving reinforcements toward the breakthrough became a nightmare of destroyed bridges and bombed columns. What made the situation unrecoverable for the Germans was that American forces weren't just breaking through, they were accelerating. Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st, 1944, began a drive across France that would cover distances in weeks that had taken months to fight over in World War I. This wasn't just because of better technology or more fuel. It was because obstacles that should have channeled and delayed American movement, towns, rivers, and yes, hedgerows were being overcome faster than German staffs could plan for them. The Rhino device became a symbol of this adaptability, even though by August most American tanks were operating in terrain where hedgerows were no longer the primary obstacle. What mattered was what the device represented: an American military that could identify problems and solve them at the point of contact without waiting for solutions from distant headquarters or factories. German military observers, in the reports that survive, struggled to explain what had happened in Normandy. They understood they'd been outproduced, this was obvious. They recognized that Allied air superiority had been decisive, also obvious. What some reports hint at, without quite articulating clearly, was a deeper concern about adaptation. The Americans they'd faced in North Africa in 1942 and early 1943 had been inexperienced, prone to mistakes, sometimes predictable. The Americans smashing through France in summer 1944 were a different force, not because individual soldiers were better trained, but because the entire system had learned and adapted. This learning curve had been visible throughout the war. Early American tank doctrine had emphasized frontal assault and firepower. Encounters with German armor in Tunisia had taught painful lessons about the Sherman's limitations in direct combat. Rather than attempting to redesign the Sherman from scratch, a process that would have taken years, American doctrine adapted. Shermans began operating in combined arms teams with tank destroyers and infantry. Tactics emphasized flanking and overwhelming numbers rather than armor-to-armor duels. Crews learned to use terrain and smoke. And when specific obstacles like the Bocage emerged, field modifications like the Rhino provided tactical answers. The German military had its own impressive adaptation capabilities, particularly in defensive operations. But German industry couldn't match the scale of American production, which meant German adaptations often involved making do with fewer tanks, less fuel, fewer replacements. American adaptations involved making existing abundance more effective, which was a fundamentally easier problem to solve. By late August 1944, the Normandy campaign was effectively over. German forces that had held the Bocage for 2 months were in full retreat toward the Seine. The Allied drive would eventually stall at the German border due to logistics, a reminder that even American industrial capacity had limits, but the breakthrough itself was complete. Curtis Culin's contribution to this outcome was significant but not unique. Across the Allied armies in Normandy, soldiers and junior officers were innovating constantly. British forces developed the Crocodile flamethrower tank and specialized armor for different obstacles. Canadian units perfected techniques for night attacks. American engineers became expert at rapid bridge construction. The Rhino was one innovation among hundreds, distinguished mainly by how quickly it spread and how clearly it addressed a specific problem. Culin himself received the Legion of Merit for his design. He survived the war and returned to New Jersey, where he lived until 1993. In later interviews, he was characteristically modest about his contribution, noting that many tankers had been working on similar ideas and that he'd happened to find a combination that worked. This modesty was probably accurate. The historical record shows multiple independent attempts to solve the Hedgerow problem, with Culin's version becoming standard partly because it was effective and partly because it was tested at the right moment to receive official backing. The broader legacy of the Rhino device extends beyond its tactical impact. It became a teaching example in military history, illustrating the importance of distributed initiative and the advantages of military systems that can absorb and scale innovations from below. The United States military, in subsequent conflicts, has sometimes struggled to maintain this flexibility bureaucracy, and procurement processes have often slowed the adoption of field innovations. But the Normandy Hedgerow experience remains a benchmark for what's possible when necessity, ingenuity, and institutional support align. For the soldiers who fought in the Bocage, the Rhino tanks were simply a tool that made their job less suicidal. The difference between attacking through a gap covered by German machine guns versus smashing through a hedgerow at a point of your choosing was the difference between acceptable casualties and unacceptable ones. Tank crews who had watched friends burn in Shermans stuck halfway over a hedge embankment had very practical appreciation for any device that kept their tank level and moving. The Germans who faced Rhino-equipped Shermans had a different perspective. For them, the device was another example of American material. Excess, of course, the Americans would modify thousands of tanks to solve a specific problem, because of course they had thousands of tanks to modify. This perception wasn't entirely wrong, but it missed the improvisational nature of the solution. The Rhino wasn't a product of vast research and development budgets. It was scrap metal and welding, conceived by a sergeant and approved by a general who recognized he didn't have time to wait for a perfect solution. The irony that opens this story, American industrial might being stymied by French farmland, resolved itself, not through more industry, but through smarter application of existing resources. The beach obstacles that German engineers had designed to stop the invasion became the raw material for devices that helped win the campaign beyond the beaches. The Wehrmacht's own Atlantic Wall, in a sense, provided the tools for its defeat in Normandy. This circularity appears repeatedly in the material history of World War II. German equipment captured in North Africa was studied to improve American designs. Japanese logistics failures were caused partly by American submarines using tactics the Japanese themselves had pioneered. The war was decided by production capacity, but the application of that capacity was shaped by thousands of small decisions, adaptations, and improvisations that determined whether material superiority translated into battlefield success. The Bocage problem could have been worse. If the Germans had recognized the defensive potential of the Normandy hedgerows earlier and fortified the terrain more deliberately, if they'd positioned more reserves closer to the coast, if their command structure had been less rigid and more able to exploit Allied mistakes, the fighting might have dragged on much longer. As it happened, a combination of German errors, Allied persistence, and innovations like the Rhino turned what could have been a catastrophic stalemate into a decisive breakthrough. But the breakthrough wasn't inevitable. The planners who failed to anticipate the Bocage problem before D-Day had created the conditions for potential disaster. The soldiers who died in late June and early July, fighting field to field, paid the price for that failure. The fact that the Allied forces recovered from this mistake and adapted successfully doesn't erase the cost of the initial oversight. This is perhaps the harder lesson of the Rhino story. Military histories often celebrate innovation and adaptation, and rightly so. But they sometimes gloss over the question of why adaptation was necessary in the first place. The hedgerow problem was solvable with pre-invasion planning. Accurate terrain analysis, consultation with people familiar with Norman agriculture, or even careful reading of French geographic surveys would have revealed the Bocage as a significant obstacle. Tank units could have trained on similar terrain in England. Specialized breaching equipment could have been designed and manufactured before the invasion. Instead, the problem was discovered in combat and solved in combat, at a cost measured in burned tanks and dead crews. The solution worked. The campaign succeeded, but the necessity of the solution reflected a failure of foresight that could have been avoided. The American military's strength in World War II was not that it made fewer mistakes than its enemies. The American military made plenty of mistakes: poor initial tank design, underestimation of German tactical skill, over-reliance on strategic bombing, logistical overreach in late 1944. The American strength was the capacity to recognize mistakes quickly and correct them with overwhelming resources. This is a real advantage, but it's not the same as excellence in initial planning. The Rhino device demonstrated both sides of this equation. It showed the positive: distributed problem-solving, rapid scaling, effective use of available materials. It also showed the negative: problems that shouldn't have been surprises, costly learning curves, solutions that were necessary only because of earlier failures. For Curtis Cullen, none of this theoretical analysis mattered much. He'd seen a problem, thought of a solution, built it, and watched it work. The larger strategic implications were someone else's concern. This is characteristic of how most innovations actually happen in combat. The people closest to the problem solve it because they need it solved, not because they're thinking about military theory or historical legacy. The institutional recognition Cullen received was appropriate, but the real reward was simpler. Tanks in his unit stopped getting stuck on hedgerows. Friends stopped dying in predictable kill zones. The mission became achievable instead of suicidal. This is what innovation means at ground level, not revolutionary breakthroughs, but incremental improvements that shift the odds from impossible to merely difficult. By September 1944, the Bocage was behind the advancing Allied armies. The character of the fighting had changed to urban combat, river, crossings, and eventually the prepared defences of the Siegfried Line. The Rhino devices remained attached to many Shermans, occasionally useful in different terrain, but no longer the critical innovation they'd been in July. Some tanks kept them for the entire war. Others had them removed when the added weight and frontal profile became disadvantages in different tactical situations. The devices themselves were not technologically sophisticated. Metallurgically, they were crude, welded joints that a peacetime inspector would have rejected, steel cut with field-expedient tools rather than proper machining. But they worked, which in combat is the only standard that matters. Elegant engineering is for peacetime. War rewards whatever functions under stress. This perhaps explains why the Rhino story has endured in military history, while countless other field modifications have been forgotten. It's a clean narrative: problem, solution, success. The reality was messier, multiple, simultaneous attempts to solve the Hedgerow issue, some failures, incremental improvements, and a generous helping of luck in timing and placement. But the core story remains valid. A sergeant figured out how to cut through hedges using German beach obstacles. The army adopted his design. Tanks that had been vulnerable became effective. The campaign succeeded. In the context of World War II's vast scale, millions of soldiers, thousands of battles, entire continents transformed, the Hedgerow cutter was a minor footnote. But for the men in 2nd Armoured Division in July 1944, it was the difference between progress and stalemate, between acceptable losses and unit destruction. This gap between strategic insignificance and tactical decisiveness is where most of war actually happens. Grand strategy matters, but it's executed by individuals solving immediate problems with whatever tools are available. The Norman farmers who built the Bocage hedgerows centuries earlier had no conception that their field boundaries would one day become military obstacles. They were solving a different problem: keeping cattle contained, marking property lines, providing windbreaks for crops. The roots grew deep and strong because that served agricultural purposes. That the same characteristics made the hedgerows into defensive barriers was an accident of history. Similarly, the German engineers who designed the Atlantic Wall beach obstacles had no idea their creations would be recycled into American tank modifications. They'd built barriers to stop landing craft, using the strongest materials available. That those materials would later punch through the very hedgerows meant to aid German defense was an irony no one planned. War is full of these unexpected connections. Materials designed for one purpose get repurposed for another. Terrain chosen for agricultural reasons becomes tactically decisive. Solutions to immediate problems have strategic consequences no one anticipated. The Rhino device sits at the intersection of all these coincidences: the ancient hedgerows, the German obstacles, the American improvisational culture, the specific moment when the Normandy campaign needed exactly this kind of innovation. If Coulin had been assigned to a different division, if the 2nd Armoured had been positioned in a different sector, if Bradley had committed to a different breakout timeline, the story might have unfolded differently. Perhaps another soldier in another unit would have designed a similar device. Perhaps the Hedgerow problem would have been solved through different means. Perhaps the Normandy campaign would have taken longer, cost more lives, changed the trajectory of the entire European war. These counterfactuals are ultimately unanswerable, but they highlight how contingent historical outcomes actually are. The things we remember as inevitable Allied victory in Normandy, the breakthrough at Saint-Lô, the race across France, all depended on thousands of smaller decisions and accidents aligning in particular ways. The Rhino device was one such alignment: the right idea, at the right time, in a system capable of scaling it rapidly. For anyone seeking lessons from this story, the most important may be about organizational culture. The American military in World War II was not inherently superior to its enemies in tactics, strategy, or initial equipment quality. What made it effective was a culture that valued problem-solving over doctrine, that empowered junior leaders to innovate, and that could rapidly scale solutions from individual initiative to army-wide deployment. These characteristics can't be manufactured overnight. They emerge from institutional values, training approaches, and command philosophies developed over years. The Wehrmacht, for all its tactical excellence, struggled with this kind of flexibility. Junior officers had initiative in combat operations, but less latitude in questioning doctrine or proposing systematic changes. Innovation came from specialized research units and headquarters staffs, not from frontline improvisation. When new solutions were needed, the system was slow to adapt. This rigidity became more costly as the war progressed, and Germany's material disadvantages made rapid adaptation increasingly critical. The contrast played out across every theatre of World War II, but nowhere more clearly than in Normandy in summer 1944. German forces fought with skill and determination, using terrain expertly and making the Allies pay for every mile. But when the Allies adapted, when tanks started smashing through hedgerows instead of climbing over them, the German defensive system couldn't adjust quickly enough to counter the new reality. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.